The sound of my phone buzzing against the marble countertop made me look up from the client presentation I was reviewing. The name on the screen made my stomach drop. Harrison's Fine Jewelry. Why would they be calling me on a Tuesday afternoon? I'd only been there once, 2 years ago, to have my grandmother's ring appraised and insured. My hand trembled slightly as I answered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mrs. Thompson, this is Janet from Harrison's Fine Jewelry. I'm calling because we have a gentleman here who says he's your husband, and he's trying to sell a vintage diamond ring that matches the description of the one in our records under your name. The words hit me like ice water. I'm sorry. What did you say? A Mr. David Thompson is here with a 1940s diamond engagement ring with the inscription, "Forever Yours, James," on the inside band. According to our records, you had this exact piece appraised and insured with us. He claims it belongs to him, but our policy requires verification for high-value items like this one. My vision blurred. The presentation slides on my laptop. Screen became meaningless shapes as the reality of what was happening crashed over me. Don't let him leave, I managed to whisper. I'll be right there. The drive from my office in downtown Phoenix to Harrison's Fine Jewelry felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white as I navigated through the scorching Arizona heat, the desert sun beating down mercilessly on my car's windshield. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every slow driver, an obstacle between me and the truth I wasn't ready to face. My name is Emma Rodriguez-Thompson, though right now I'm questioning whether I should still be using that hyphenated last name. I'm 32 years old, a senior marketing coordinator at Pinnacle Creative Solutions, and until 20 minutes ago, I thought I was living a pretty good life. David and I have been married for 4 years, together for 6, and we own a beautiful house in one of Scottsdale's quieter neighborhoods. We're not wealthy, but we're comfortable. We take weekend trips to Sedona, host barbecues for our friends, and I genuinely believed we were building something solid together. The ring that David was apparently trying to sell wasn't just any ring. It was my grandmother's engagement ring, passed down from her to my mother, and then to me when Mom died 3 years ago. Abuela Rosa had worn that ring for 57 years of marriage to my grandfather, James. She used to tell me stories about how he saved up for months working double shifts at the copper mine just to buy her that ring. How he had it specially, engraved with those 3 words that would define their entire relationship, "Forever yours, James." When my mother passed away from cancer, she made me promise to keep the ring safe. "Mija," she'd said, her voice weak but determined. "This ring carries the love of 3 generations. Don't let anyone take that away from you." I'd slipped it onto my right hand that day and had worn it every single day since. It wasn't the biggest diamond, maybe 1.5 carats, but it was flawless, and the vintage setting was intricate and beautiful. More importantly, it was priceless to me. David knew the story. He'd held my hand at Mom's funeral, listened to me cry about losing her, and understood why I wore that ring daily. He'd even suggested we get it appraised and insured, saying it was smart to protect something so valuable. "You never know what could happen," he'd said with what I thought was genuine concern. Better safe than sorry. Now I was beginning to understand what he'd really meant. As I pulled into the parking lot of the strip mall where Harrison's Fine Jewelry was located, my mind raced through the past few months, searching for signs I might have missed. David had been working late more often, claiming he had several big real estate deals in the works. He'd been secretive about his phone, taking calls in the other room and being vague about who he was talking to. There had been unexplained expenses showing up on our joint credit card, small amounts that he'd brushed off as client dinners or work-related costs. But the thing that really made my stomach turn was remembering last weekend. David had been unusually affectionate, bringing me coffee in bed, suggesting we spend the day together. He'd asked me to take off my rings while we gardened, saying the dirt might damage them. I'd put them on the bathroom counter, and when I went to put them back on that evening, I could have sworn the ring looked different somehow. The setting seemed to catch the light differently. But David had laughed when I mentioned it, saying I was being paranoid, that all rings look different in different lighting. Had he already replaced it with a fake? Had I been wearing a replica of my grandmother's ring for the past week? The jewelry store was small but elegant, with displays of gleaming diamonds and gold jewelry arranged behind pristine glass cases. The moment I walked in, I could see David at the far counter, his back to me, talking animatedly to a woman in a navy blazer who I assumed was Janet. Even from behind, I could tell he was agitated. His shoulders were tense, and he kept running his hand through his dark hair the way he did when he was frustrated. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying across the quiet store. "I'm Emma Thompson." David spun around, and the expression on his face was something I'd never seen before. It wasn't guilt or embarrassment. It was panic, pure and simple. His usually confident demeanor crumbled in an instant, replaced by the look of someone who'd been caught red-handed doing something terrible. "Emma," he stammered, "what are you doing here?" Janet, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, stepped forward. "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for coming so quickly. I'm Janet Harrison, the owner. We called because we have strict policies about high-value items, especially ones with such detailed provenance in our system." She gestured to the counter where my grandmother's ring sat in a small velvet tray under the bright lights. Even from a few feet away, I could see it was definitely the real ring. The way the diamond caught the light, the intricate mill-grain details on the platinum setting, the slight wear on the band that came from decades of being worn by hands that worked hard and loved deeply. "David," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "What is this?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, then tried again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Look, Emma, I can explain. It's not what it looks like. It looks like you're trying to sell my grandmother's ring without my knowledge or permission," I said, taking a step closer to the counter. "So please, explain to me what it actually is, because I'm having trouble coming up with an alternative explanation." Janet cleared her throat gently. "Perhaps I should give you two some privacy. I'll be in the back office if you need anything." She disappeared through a door behind the counter, leaving David and me alone with the weight of this betrayal hanging between us. "Emma, we need money," David said finally, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "You know the real estate market has been tough lately. I haven't closed a deal in 2 months and we're behind on the mortgage. I thought if I could just sell the ring, we could get back on our feet, and then I'd find a way to get it back for you later." I stared at him, waiting for the rest of the lie, because I knew it was a lie. I handled our finances. I knew exactly how much money we had, how much we owed, and what our monthly expenses were. We weren't rich, but we weren't anywhere close to desperate either. We had savings, we had options. We definitely didn't need to sell my dead grandmother's ring to keep our house. "Try again," I said quietly. David's jaw tightened. "What do you mean, try again?" "I just told you the truth. David, I balance our checkbook every month. I know we're not behind on the mortgage. I know we have $12,000 in our savings account. I know you closed the Peterson deal 3 weeks ago for a 6-figure commission. So try again, and this time, tell me the truth." The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic outside, the tick of an antique clock on the wall. David's face went through a series of expressions: anger, frustration, resignation, before he finally looked away from me. "There's someone else," he said so quietly I almost didn't hear him. The words hit me like a physical blow. even though part of me had known this was coming. Someone else. Her name is Stephanie. We've been seeing each other for about 6 months. He still wouldn't look at me. She's been having car trouble, and her old Honda finally died completely. She needs something reliable for work, and I wanted to help her. So you decided to sell my grandmother's ring to buy your girlfriend a car? It's not like that. Then what is it like, David? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that. He finally met my eyes, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. It wasn't remorse or guilt. It was irritation, as if I was being unreasonable for being upset about this. Look, Emma, it's just a ring. It's been sitting in your jewelry box for 3 years. You never even wear it anymore since your mom died. It's not like you were using it. The casual cruelty of his words took my breath away. Just a ring? David, that ring represents 3 generations of my family. It was my great-grandmother's, my grandmother's, my mother's. It's all I have left of them. But it's also worth $15,000, he said, his tone becoming more defensive. $15,000 that could actually help someone, instead of just sitting in a box collecting dust. Stephanie needs a car to get to work. That's practical. That's helping a real person with a real problem. I felt something shift inside me, a cold clarity that cut through the shock and hurt. This wasn't just about infidelity. This wasn't just about lying. This was about fundamental disrespect for me, for my family, for everything I held dear. David had looked at the most precious thing I owned, something that carried the love and history of the women who came before me, and he'd seen nothing but a commodity to be sold for his girlfriend's convenience. Where is she now? I asked. What? Stephanie, where is she right now? David's face flushed. She's at Premier Auto Gallery looking at cars. But Emma, you don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly. I turned to the back office and called out, Janet, could you come back out here, please? Janet emerged from the back office, her expression carefully neutral but clearly concerned. Yes, Mrs. Thompson? I need to know exactly what the procedure is for someone trying to sell a ring that doesn't belong to them, legally speaking. David went pale. Emma, don't be ridiculous. Technically, we're married, so it's community property anyway. Janet looked uncomfortable. Actually, sir, in Arizona, inherited property typically remains separate property unless it's been commingled. Since Mrs. Thompson inherited this ring and it was specifically bequeathed to her, it would likely be considered her separate property. What does that mean? I asked. It means that legally, your husband cannot sell this ring without your explicit consent. If he had completed the sale, it could potentially be considered theft. The word theft hung in the air like a thunderclap. David's face went from pale to red. This is insane. Emma, you're my wife. You're really going to threaten me with legal action over a ring? You're my husband, I replied, and you're really going to steal from me to buy another woman a car? Janet stepped forward carefully. Mrs. Thompson, would you like me to return the ring to you? Mr. Thompson hasn't completed any transaction yet, so there's no sale to reverse. Yes, please. She handed me the small velvet tray, and I picked up my grandmother's ring with trembling fingers. The moment I touched it, I felt a connection to all the women who had worn it before me. Strong women who had faced challenges and betrayals and heartbreak, but who had survived and thrived. I slipped it back onto my right hand where it belonged. David, I want you to call Stephanie and tell her the car deal is off. Emma, be reasonable. I want you to call her right now and tell her that you're not buying her a car, that you're not leaving your wife, and that whatever relationship you two have is over. I'm not doing that. Then I guess we have nothing more to talk about. I turned to Janet. Thank you for calling me. You probably saved me from a much bigger heartache down the road. Mrs. Thompson, Janet said gently, you might want to consider having the ring reappraised and updating your insurance. Given what's happened today, it would be wise to have extra documentation of its ownership and value. That's an excellent idea. Could you recommend someone? Actually, we work with an independent appraiser who specializes in vintage pieces. She's very thorough, and she documents everything for insurance and legal purposes. I could call her for you. Please do. As Janet went to make the call, David grabbed my arm. Emma, you're being irrational. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can figure this out together. I looked down at his hand on my arm, then back up at his face. David, 3 hours ago, I thought I was married to someone who loved and respected me. 3 hours. Ago, I thought the most precious thing I owned was safe in my own home. 3 hours ago, I thought I could trust my husband not to steal from me to finance his affair. A lot has changed in 3 hours. But we can fix this. Can we? Can you? Give me back the 6 months you've been lying to me? Can you give me back the trust you've broken? Can you undo the fact that you looked at my dead mother's ring and saw nothing but cash for your girlfriend? He didn't have an answer for that. Janet returned from the back office. Mrs. Thompson, I've spoken with Sarah Martinez, the appraiser. She can see you tomorrow morning at 10 if that works for you. She said, given the circumstances, she'll put a rush on the documentation. That's perfect. Thank you so much. I turned back to David one last time. I'm going back to work now. When I get home tonight, I expect you to be honest with me about everything. How long this has been going on? How much money you've spent? On her? What else you've lied about? Everything. Because, David, this isn't just about the ring anymore. This is about whether our marriage can survive the kind of betrayal you've shown me today. I walked out of that jewelry store with my grandmother's ring back on my finger and a cold, clear understanding of exactly who I had married. The Arizona. Sun felt different on my face as I walked to my car. Harsher. More revealing. Like it was burning away the illusions I'd been living with and showing me the truth underneath. As I drove back to my office, I thought about what David had said about the ring just sitting in my jewelry box, collecting dust. He was wrong about that, but not in the way he thought. The ring hadn't been sitting idle. It had been waiting to show me who David really was. Waiting to reveal the kind of man who would steal from his wife to impress another woman. Waiting to give me the clarity I needed to see my marriage for what it really was. I had no idea that the ring had one more secret to reveal, one that would change everything I thought I knew about my husband, my marriage, and the life I'd been building in Phoenix. But that revelation would have to wait until tomorrow's appointment with Sarah Martinez. For now, all I knew was that the most precious thing I owned was safe on my finger, and the man I thought I could trust had shown me exactly who he really was. The question now wasn't whether our marriage could survive David's betrayal. The question was whether I wanted it to. The rest of my workday passed in a strange haze. I sat through client meetings, responded to emails, and made decisions about marketing campaigns while my mind replayed the scene at Harrison's Fine Jewelry over and over again. My colleagues must have noticed something was off because Maria Santos, my closest friend at the office and the account manager for our biggest client, knocked on my office door around 4 o'clock. Emma, you look like you've seen a ghost. Everything okay? Maria's dark eyes were filled with concern as she closed the door behind her and took a seat across from my desk. I hadn't planned to tell anyone what happened, but looking at Maria's kind face, the words just spilled out. I told her everything. About the phone call, about finding David at the jewelry store, about Stephanie and the car and the 6 months of lies. Maria listened without interrupting, her expression growing more incredulous with each detail. He tried to sell your grandmother's ring to buy his mistress a car? Maria's voice was barely above a whisper, but I could hear the fury building in it. Emma, that's not just cheating. That's calculated cruelty. I keep thinking about what he said, about it just collecting dust. Like the fact that I wasn't actively using it somehow made it worthless. I twisted the ring on my finger, feeling the familiar weight of it, the slight roughness where the engraving was worn smooth from decades of wear. That ring isn't just jewelry, Emma. It's your family's legacy. Your grandmother wore that ring through the Depression, through World War II, through raising 6 children and working in the cotton fields. Your mother wore it through your father's deployment in Vietnam, through building their business from nothing, through her cancer treatments. And David thought it was appropriate to cash it in for some woman's Honda replacement. When Maria put it that way, the full scope of David's betrayal hit me again like a fresh wave. This wasn't just about the money or even about the affair. This was about the complete disregard for everything that mattered to me, everything that made me who I was. "What are you going to do?" Maria asked gently. "I don't know." I told him I wanted the truth about everything when I got home tonight. "But honestly, Maria, I don't think I can ever trust him again. How do you come back from something like this?" Maria was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward. "Emma, can I ask you something? When was the last time David made you feel truly valued? Not just as a wife or a convenience, but as a person whose thoughts and feelings mattered to him?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it, then tried again. The silence stretched on as I searched my memory for a recent example of David truly listening to me, truly considering my perspective on something important. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that David's disregard for me hadn't started with Stephanie. It had been building for years, so gradually that I hadn't noticed it happening. "I can't remember," I admitted finally. "Then maybe this isn't about whether you can forgive him for the affair. Maybe this is about whether you want to stay married to someone who fundamentally doesn't respect you." Maria's words stayed with me during the drive home to Scottsdale. Our house sat on a quiet street lined with desert willows and Palo Verde trees, the kind of neighborhood where people took pride in their xeriscaped front yards and knew their neighbors' names. David and I had bought the house 3 years ago, shortly after we got married, and I'd loved everything about it from the moment I walked through the front door. The open floor plan, the large windows that let in the desert light, the master bedroom with its view of the mountains in the distance. Now, as I pulled into our driveway, the house looked different somehow. Smaller. Less like a home and more like a place where 2 people happened to sleep under the same roof. David's car was already in the garage, which meant he'd beaten me home. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering my courage for whatever conversation was about to happen. Through the kitchen window, I could see him moving around, probably making dinner or cleaning up the breakfast dishes I'd left in the sink that morning when I'd rushed out to make an early client meeting. The normalcy of it felt surreal. 6 hours ago, I'd discovered my husband was having an affair and trying to sell my most precious possession. Now he was in our kitchen, probably humming along to whatever music he had playing, acting like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. When I walked through the front door, the smell of garlic and onions hit me immediately. David was making his famous chicken fajitas, the dish he always prepared when he wanted to get back into my good graces after an argument. He looked up from the stove when I entered the kitchen, his expression carefully neutral. "Hey, babe, how was the rest of your day?" The casual tone, the pet name, the way he was acting like this was any other Tuesday evening made my stomach turn. "Enlightening," I said, setting my purse on the counter. "Yours?" "Oh, you know, the usual. Showed a few houses, made some calls." He turned back to the stove, stirring the peppers and onions with unnecessary focus. "Dinner should be ready in about 10 minutes. I watched him cook, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided looking directly at me. This was David's strategy whenever we had a serious conflict. Pretend everything was normal until I got tired of being upset and let it go. It had worked in the past for smaller issues, but this wasn't a forgotten anniversary or a disagreement about whose turn it was to take out the trash. "David, We need to talk. Can it wait until after dinner? I'm right in the middle of this, and you know how fajitas get soggy if you let them sit. No, it can't wait. He sighed dramatically, as if I was being unreasonable, and turned off the burner. Fine. What do you want to talk about? I want you to tell me everything about Stephanie. David's jaw tightened. Emma, I already told you. You told me her name and that you've been seeing her for 6 months. That's not everything. I want to know how you met her, where you've been taking her, how much money you've spent on her, whether you've brought her to our house, whether any of our friends know about her. Everything. Why do you want to torture yourself with details? Because I need to know the scope of the lies I've been living with. I need to understand how thoroughly you've been deceiving me. David slumped against the kitchen counter, suddenly looking older than his 34 years. Her name is Stephanie Walsh. She's 26. She works as a receptionist at Miller & Associates, the law firm downtown. I met her when I was showing a condo to one of their partners. I felt a chill run down my spine. Miller & Associates was 3 blocks from my office. For the past 6 months, while I'd been going to work every day, building campaigns and meeting with clients and living my life, David's girlfriend had been working 3 blocks away from me. Go on. We started talking after the showing. She seemed interested in real estate, asked a lot of questions about the market. I offered to take her to coffee to talk about investment opportunities. When was this? Last October. October. That meant it had been 8 months, not 6. David couldn't even be honest about the timeline. And when did coffee turn into an affair? Emma, I don't think... When, David? Around Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. I remembered that holiday clearly. We'd hosted his parents and his sisters, family at our house. I'd spent 3 days cooking and cleaning and decorating while David complained about having to deal with family drama. The whole time he'd been carrying on with another woman, probably texting her while I carved the turkey and made polite conversation with his mother. Have you brought her here? David's silence was answer enough. When? Just a few times. When you were out of town for work. Which times? Emma, what difference does it make? Which times, David? The conference in Denver in January, the client retreat in San Diego in March, and when you went to visit your cousin in Tucson last month. 3 times. He'd brought another woman into our home, into our bedroom, while I was away working to support the life we'd built together. I thought about the weekend I'd spent in Tucson with my cousin Carmen, how I'd called David every night to check in, how he'd sounded distant, but claimed he was just tired from work. Did you sleep with her in our bed? Emma, please. Did you sleep with her in our bed? Yes. The word hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. Which bed? The guest room or our bedroom? Our bedroom. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the images that were flooding my mind. The sheets I'd washed and ironed, the bed I'd shared with him for 4 years, the room where I'd grieved my mother's death and celebrated David's business successes and made love to the man I thought was committed to our marriage. What else? What do you mean? What else have you lied about? What other money have you spent on her? What other ways have you betrayed me that I haven't figured out yet? David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he calculated how much truth he could get away with telling me. I've taken her on a few trips. Nothing major, just weekend getaways. Where? Sedona, Flagstaff, Las Vegas once. Sedona, our place. The red rocks and the hiking trails and the little bed and breakfast where David and I had spent our first anniversary, where we'd talked about buying a vacation home someday when we could afford it. He'd taken her there. When you told me you were going to real estate conferences, some of those were real conferences, but not all of them. No, not all of them. How much money have you spent on her? Emma, how much, David? Maybe $3,000 or $4,000 over the months. Dinners, hotels, gifts, nothing crazy. $3,000 or $4,000. Money from our joint accounts. Money we'd been saving for a down payment on a bigger house. Money I'd contributed to with every paycheck while thinking we were building a future together. What kind of gifts? Jewelry, clothes, nothing expensive. More expensive than what you've bought. Me in the past year? David's face flushed red, and I had my answer. In the 12 months since my last birthday, David had bought me exactly 3 gifts. A generic gift card to Target for Christmas, a wilted bouquet of grocery store flowers for Valentine's Day, and nothing at all for our anniversary because he'd forgotten, until it was too late to make reservations anywhere decent. And today, when you tried to sell my ring, that money was going toward a car for her? She needed reliable transportation. Her Honda died and she can't afford car payments on her salary. So you decided to sell my family heirloom to solve her financial problems. Emma, it's just a ring. Stop saying that. My voice came out sharper than I'd intended. Stop saying it's just a ring. It's not just a ring, David. It's the only physical connection I have left to 3 generations of women in my family. It's the ring my great-grandfather saved for months to buy. It's the ring my grandmother wore while she waited for my grandfather to come home from World War II. It's the ring my mother was wearing when she died. But it's also worth $15,000 that could actually help someone. It could help someone? David, I am someone. I'm your wife. And that ring helps me feel connected to my family, to my history, to the women who came before me and made me who I am. But apparently, my feelings don't matter as much as Stephanie's transportation needs. That's not what I meant. Then, what did you mean? David opened his mouth, then closed it, then shook his head. I don't know, Emma. I don't know what I meant. This whole thing is complicated. No, David, it's really not complicated. You met another woman. You decided you wanted to be with her instead of me. Instead of being honest about that, you spent 8 months lying to me, stealing from me, and making me feel crazy for noticing that something was wrong. Then, when you decided you wanted to buy her a car, you tried to sell my most precious possession without my knowledge or consent. None of that is complicated. It's just cruel. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of our neighbor's dog barking. David stared at the floor, and I stared at him. This man I'd married, this person I'd trusted with my heart and my future, and my grandmother's ring. What do you want me to do, Emma? I want you to call Stephanie right now and end it. Emma. Right now, David. In front of me. I want you to call her and tell her that you're ending the relationship, that you're not buying her a car, and that you're going to try to save your marriage. And if I do that, you'll forgive me? The question hung in the air between us. Would I forgive him? Could I forgive him? Could I ever trust him again? Could I ever look at him without thinking about Stephanie in our bed, about the lies he'd told, about the way he'd casually dismissed my grandmother's ring as worthless junk? I don't know, I said honestly. But if you don't do it, we're definitely done. David pulled his phone out of his pocket and stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked at me. And you'll really try? You'll really try to work this out? I'll try to try, David. That's all I can promise right now. He nodded and dialed a number. I watched his face as the phone rang, noting the way his expression softened when she answered. Hey, Steph, it's me. His voice was gentle in a way it hadn't been when he talked to me all evening. Listen, I need to talk to you about something important. I could hear the faint sound of a female voice on the other end of the line, but I couldn't make out the words. No, I can't meet you tonight. That's actually what I need to talk to you about. Stephanie, I think we need to take a break from seeing each other. More talking from her end, her voice rising in pitch. No, it's not about the car. Well, it's partly about the car. Look, Emma found out about us. and she's willing to work things out, and I think I need to try to save my marriage. A longer response from Stephanie, and I could tell she wasn't taking this well. I know I said that, but things are complicated. She's my wife, Stephanie. We have history together. More talking, and now I could hear the anger in her voice, even through the phone. No, I understand you're upset, but this is what I have to do. I'm sorry. David hung up the phone and looked at me. There, it's done. But even as he said the words, I could see in his eyes that it wasn't really done. He'd said what I'd asked him to say, but his heart wasn't in it. He was angry at me for making him make that call. He was probably already thinking about when he could call her back, when he could explain that I'd forced him to end things, when he could reassure her that this was just temporary. Thank you, I said, even though I knew it was meaningless. So, what now? Now we eat dinner, and tomorrow we figure out how to move forward. We ate the fajitas in silence, both of us going through the motions of a normal evening meal while everything between us remained fundamentally broken. David kept glancing at his phone, and I kept thinking about what Maria had asked me about the last time he'd made me feel valued. After dinner, while David loaded the dishwasher, I went to our bedroom and looked around with new eyes. Everything looked the same, but I couldn't stop thinking about him being here with Stephanie, about her wearing my bathrobes, using my towels, sleeping on my side of the bed. I opened my jewelry box and looked at the space where my grandmother's ring had been sitting for the past week while I'd been wearing what I now realized must have been a fake. David had been planning this for at least a week, maybe longer. He'd taken the real ring, had a replica made, and waited for the right opportunity to sell it. The level of premeditation involved made me feel sick. That night, I lay in bed next to David, both of us pretending to sleep, both of us knowing that nothing would ever be the same between us. Every few minutes, I heard his phone buzz with what I assumed were text messages from Stephanie. He didn't answer them, but I could feel the tension in his body every time the phone lit up. Around midnight, I heard him get up and go to the bathroom. A few minutes later, I heard the soft sound of him typing on his phone. When he came back to bed, he was more relaxed, and his phone had stopped buzzing. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and realized that nothing had really changed. David had made the phone call I'd demanded, but he was already in contact with Stephanie again. Tomorrow, he'd probably call her and explain that I'd forced him to break up with her, that it wasn't what he really wanted, that they just needed to be more careful until he could figure out how to leave me. But David didn't know that I had an appointment with an insurance appraiser in the morning. He didn't know that the ring he'd tried to sell had secrets he'd never imagined. And he definitely didn't know that his 8 months of lies were about to catch up with him in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I thought about my grandmother and the stories she used to tell me about the early days of her marriage to my grandfather. "Mia," she'd said, "marriage isn't just about love. It's about respect and trust and partnership. When those things are gone, love isn't enough to hold two people together." Tomorrow, I would find out just how much David had underestimated both, me and the ring he'd tried to steal. Tomorrow, everything would change again. The morning sun streaming through our bedroom windows felt different somehow, harsher and more revealing than it had just 24 hours earlier. I woke up before my alarm, David's side of the bed already empty and cold. The sound of the shower running told me he was getting ready for another day of pretending everything was normal, while I prepared to discover just how deep his deceptions ran. My appointment with Sarah Martinez, the insurance appraiser, was at 10 o'clock, which gave me enough time to stop by the office and handle a few urgent emails before heading to her evaluation center across town. David had already left for work by the time I finished my coffee, leaving behind only the lingering scent of his cologne and a hastily scribbled note on the kitchen counter. "Working late tonight. Don't wait up." The note felt like a slap in the face. Less than 12 hours after promising to try to save our marriage, he was already making excuses to avoid coming home. I crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash, wondering how many other working late nights had actually been spent with Stephanie. The drive to Sarah Martinez's office took me through a part of Phoenix I rarely visited, an area near the airport, where industrial buildings mixed with small professional offices. Her evaluation center was located in a nondescript building that housed several businesses. But the moment I walked into her office, I could tell Sarah took her work seriously. The walls were lined with certificates and credentials, and every surface was covered with specialized equipment for examining jewelry and precious stones. Sarah herself was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. She greeted me with a warm smile and a firm handshake, but her expression grew more serious when I explained the circumstances that had brought me to her office. Mrs. Thompson, Janet Harrison filled me in on some of the details yesterday, but I'd like to hear the full story from you before we begin the evaluation, Sarah said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from her desk. I told her everything, about discovering David at the jewelry store, about the affair, about my suspicions that he might have already replaced the real ring with a fake at some point. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. I need to know if this is really my grandmother's ring or if David somehow had a replica made, I finished. And if it is real, I want documentation that proves it belongs to me and only me. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Thompson, I have to tell you that what you're describing is more common than you might think. When valuable jewelry is involved, in marital disputes, we often see attempts at deception. The good news is that modern appraisal techniques can usually determine authenticity with a very high degree of certainty. She led me to a workstation equipped with what looked like a microscope, several different types of lights, and various tools I couldn't identify. May I see the ring? I slipped my grandmother's ring off my finger and handed it to her, watching as she examined it under a bright magnifying lamp. Her initial inspection took several minutes, during which she made small humming sounds that I couldn't interpret. Mrs. Thompson, this is definitely a genuine vintage piece. The wear patterns on the band, the style of the setting, the cut of the diamond, everything is consistent with a ring from the 1940s era. If your husband had a replica made, this isn't it. Relief flooded through me. So, this is really my grandmother's ring? Based on my initial examination, yes, but let me do a more thorough evaluation to document everything properly. Sarah moved to another piece of equipment that looked like a high-powered camera. I'm going to photograph the ring from multiple angles and document all of its characteristics. This will create a permanent record that can be used for insurance or legal purposes. As Sarah worked, she explained each step of the process. She measured the diamond using precision instruments, examined the mounting under different types of light, and photographed the inscription inside the band with macro lenses that revealed details invisible to the naked eye. The engraving is particularly helpful for authentication, she said, showing me a close-up photograph on her computer screen. See how the letters have this specific wear pattern? That comes from decades of the ring being worn and turned on. Someone's finger. It's very difficult to fake convincingly. After about an hour of detailed examination, Sarah returned to her desk and began typing up her report. Mrs. Thompson, I have some questions about the ring's history that might help complete the documentation. Of course. You mentioned that your grandmother received this ring in the 1940s. Do you have any documentation from that time period? Marriage certificates, photographs, insurance records? I have some old photos of my grandmother wearing the ring, and I think my mother kept some paperwork from when it was originally insured back in the 1980s. Why do you ask? Sarah looked up from her computer with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mrs. Thompson, during my examination, I discovered something unusual about this ring, something that might be very relevant to your current situation. My heart began to race. What kind of something? The diamond in this ring has what we call laser inscription markings. They're microscopic markings etched directly onto the stone that serve as a form of identification and authentication. These markings weren't common in the 1940s, but they became standard practice for high-value diamonds starting in the 1990s. I don't understand. What does that mean? Sarah pulled up another image on her computer screen, this one showing what looked like tiny text etched onto the diamond itself. This particular diamond has an inscription that includes a certification number from the Gemological Institute of America. When I looked up this certification number in the GIA database, I found something very interesting. She turned her computer screen toward me. According to GIA records, this diamond was originally certified in 1995. The records show that it was purchased by a jewelry store in Scottsdale and subsequently sold to a customer whose name is listed as David Thompson. The words hit me like ice water. David bought this diamond? According to the records, yes. In 1995, a David Thompson purchased this certified diamond from Goldstein's Fine Jewelry in Scottsdale for $8,000. My mind reeled as I tried to process what Sarah was telling me. But that's impossible. This is my grandmother's ring from the 1940s. David wasn't even born until 1989. Sarah's expression was grim. Mrs. Thompson, I think you need to consider the possibility that the ring you believe to be your grandmother's original engagement ring may not be what you think it is. But I have photos of my grandmother wearing this exact ring. May I see those photos? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my camera roll until I found the pictures I'd scanned and saved digitally. There was my grandmother at her wedding in 1943, wearing what looked like the exact same ring. There she was again in the 1950s, holding my infant mother, the ring clearly visible on her left hand. Sarah examined the photos carefully, zooming in on the ring in each image. Mrs. Thompson, the ring in these photos appears to have a different setting than the one you're wearing now. Look at the shape of the mounting around the diamond. In your grandmother's photos, the setting has a more rounded Art Deco style typical of the 1940s. The ring you're wearing has a more modern mounting style that became popular in the 1990s. I stared at the photos on my phone screen, comparing them to the ring that was now sitting on Sarah's desk. She was right. The settings were different. Similar enough that I hadn't noticed the difference in casual glances, but clearly different when examined closely. So what you're saying is that this isn't my grandmother's original ring? What I'm saying is that this appears to be your grandmother's original diamond, but it's been reset in a more modern mounting. The GIA records indicate that David Thompson had this stone reset in 1995. But David would have been 6 years old in 1995. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then looked at me, with sympathy in her eyes. Mrs. Thompson, is it possible that David isn't the same David Thompson who purchased this diamond? Or is it possible that there's family history you're not aware of? I thought about what I knew of David's family. His parents lived in Tucson and had been married for over 40 years. His father worked as an accountant, his mother as a school teacher. They were solid, middle-class people who lived modest lives and drove sensible cars. The idea that David's father had purchased an $8,000 diamond in 1995 seemed unlikely given what I knew about their financial situation. Could I get a copy of those GIA records? I asked. Absolutely. In fact, I'll include them with your appraisal report. Sarah returned to her typing. Mrs. Thompson, there's one more thing you should know. When I called the GIA to verify these records, they mentioned that this particular stone has been flagged in their database. Flagged for what? Apparently, about 6 months ago, someone contacted them claiming that this diamond had been stolen. They filed a report with the GIA asking to be notified if the stone ever surfaced for recertification or evaluation. The room seemed to spin around me. Someone reported it stolen? According to the GIA representative I spoke with, yes, a woman named Rosa Martinez contacted them claiming that her mother's engagement ring had been stolen from her home and that she had reason to believe someone might try to sell the diamond. Rosa Martinez. My grandmother's name was Rosa Rodriguez. Before she married my grandfather, Martinez was her maiden name. Did they give you any contact information for this Rosa Martinez? I'm not supposed to share that information directly, but I can contact the GIA and ask them to reach out to her on your behalf. They can let her know that the diamond has been located and ask if she wants to speak with you. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what Sarah was telling me. Someone named Rosa Martinez had reported my grandmother's diamond stolen. But my grandmother had been dead for 15 years. Unless... Sarah, when exactly did this Rosa Martinez contact the GIA? Sarah checked her notes. October of last year. October. The same month David had met Stephanie. The same month their affair had begun. Mrs. Thompson, are you all right? You look very pale. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to steady myself. I need to think about this. Can you finish the appraisal report and include all of this information about the GIA records and the theft report? Of course. I'll have everything ready. For you by the end of the day. But, Mrs. Thompson, I think you should seriously consider contacting the police about this. If this diamond was reported stolen, and if your husband somehow had access to it, there may be criminal implications. I nodded numbly, my mind still reeling from the revelations. Thank you, Sarah. You've been incredibly thorough. Mrs. Thompson, one last thing. The appraisal value of this ring, given the quality of the diamond and the modern setting, is $22,000. Significantly higher than the $15,000 your husband thought it was worth. $22,000. Even more than David had realized when he'd tried to sell it. I drove back to my office in a daze, Sarah's words echoing in my mind. The diamond in my grandmother's ring had been purchased by someone named David Thompson in 1995. Someone named Rosa Martinez had reported it stolen 6 months ago. My husband had tried to sell it for $15,000 when it was actually worth $22,000. None of it made sense, but I had a growing suspicion that David knew more about this ring than he'd ever let on. Back at my office, I called Maria and asked her to come to my office immediately. When she arrived, I closed the door and told her everything Sarah had discovered. Emma, this is insane, Maria said when I finished. You're telling me that David somehow had your grandmother's diamond reset in a modern mounting 28 years ago when he was 6 years old? That's what the records show. But Maria, what if it wasn't David who had it reset? What if it was someone else in his family? Like who? I don't know. His father? An uncle? A grandfather? I paused, thinking about what I knew of David's extended family. Maria, what if David's family has had my grandmother's ring all this time, and he gave it to me knowing it belonged to my family? That would mean he's known all along that the ring rightfully belonged to you. Or it would mean he stole it from someone in his own family who had stolen it originally. Maria leaned back in her chair. Emma, you need to call that Rosa Martinez person. You need to find out who she is and how she's connected to your grandmother's ring. Sarah said she'd ask the GIA to contact her on my behalf. That could take days. You don't have days. David is going to figure out that you know more than you're letting on, especially if he tries to contact the jewelry store again or if Stephanie pressures him about the car money. Maria was right. Every hour that passed was another hour for David to cover his tracks or come up with a plausible explanation for whatever he'd been hiding from me. What do you think I should do? I think you should hire a private investigator, Maria said without hesitation. You need someone who can dig into David's family history, find out who this Rosa Martinez is, and figure out how your grandmother's ring ended up in his possession. I don't know any private investigators. I do. Maria pulled out her phone. My divorce lawyer used an investigator named Detective Lisa Chen when my ex-husband was hiding assets. She's thorough, she's discreet, and she's fast. I thought about the implications of hiring a private investigator to look into my own husband's background. Once I crossed that line, there would be no going back to pretending our marriage could be saved. Emma, Maria said gently. You're not hiring an investigator because you want to destroy your marriage. You're hiring one because your marriage has already been destroyed by David's lies. You're just trying to figure out how much he's lied about. She was right. The David I'd thought I married didn't exist. The man who'd tried to sell my grandmother's ring was someone I didn't know at all, someone capable of deceptions I was only beginning to understand. Call her, I said. Maria dialed the number and spoke quietly for a few minutes before handing me the phone. She can see you at 4 o'clock today. Detective Lisa Chen's office was located in a high-rise building in downtown Phoenix, not far from the courthouse. She was a small woman in her 40s with short black hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her office was spartanly decorated but organized with military precision. Mrs. Thompson, Maria Santos spoke very highly of you, Detective Chen said as we shook hands. She also mentioned that you're dealing with some unusual circumstances involving family jewelry. I told Detective Chen everything I'd learned from Sarah Martinez, showing her copies of the GIA records and the appraisal report. I also told her about David's affair, his attempt to sell the ring, and my growing suspicion that he'd been lying about much more than just his relationship with Stephanie. Detective Chen listened carefully, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, similar to the one Sarah had used. When I finished, she was quiet for several minutes, reviewing her notes. Mrs. Thompson, what you're describing suggests several possible scenarios, some of them quite serious. Before we proceed, I need to ask you a direct question. Are you prepared to learn things about your husband that might result in criminal charges against him? The question hung in the air between us. Was I prepared? Was I ready to discover that the man I'd married was not just an adulterer, but potentially a thief? I need to know the truth, I said finally. Whatever it is. Detective Chen nodded. Then I'll begin with a background investigation into David Thompson's family history, focusing on any connections to jewelry, precious stones, or theft. I'll also try to locate this Rosa Martinez and determine her relationship to your grandmother. Finally, I'll look into David's financial records to see if there are any other irregularities you haven't discovered yet. How long will this take? For the initial investigation, probably 3 to 5 days. But Mrs. Thompson, I have to warn you that once we start digging, there's no predicting what we might find. Are you sure you're ready for this? I thought about my grandmother, about the stories she'd told me about strength and resilience. I thought about my mother, who'd faced her cancer diagnosis with courage and dignity. I thought about the ring on my finger and the legacy of strong women it represented. I'm ready, I said. Detective Chen smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. Then let's find out who David Thompson really is. Detective Chen called me at work 3 days later, her voice carrying an urgency that made my stomach clench with anticipation. Mrs. Thompson, I need to see you immediately. Can you come to my office within the hour? Did you find something? I found everything, she said grimly. And it's worse than either of us imagined. The drive to Detective Chen's office felt like it took forever. Phoenix traffic crawling under the relentless desert sun while my mind raced with possibilities. What had she discovered about David? About the ring? About the mysterious Rosa Martinez who had reported the diamond stolen? When I arrived at her office, Detective Chen had spread dozens of documents across her conference table like pieces of a puzzle that was finally coming together. Her expression was a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal outrage. Mrs. Thompson, please sit down. What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. I took a seat across from the conference table, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. Detective Chen picked up a folder marked with David's name. Let's start with your husband's background. David Thompson's real name is David Thompson Martinez. He legally changed his name when he turned 18, dropping the Martinez portion. Martinez? The name hit me like a lightning bolt. Like Rosa Martinez? Rosa Martinez is David's aunt, his father's sister. Detective Chen opened another folder. Rosa Martinez is 78 years old and lives in a nursing home in Tucson. She has advanced dementia and has been in care for the past 2 years. My mind struggled to process what she was telling me. So, David is related to the woman who reported the ring stolen. Not just related. According to the records I've obtained, Rosa Martinez was your grandmother's best friend and neighbor in Tucson from 1940 until your grandmother's death in 2009. The room seemed to tilt around me. Her best friend. Detective Chen pulled out a manila envelope and removed several black and white photographs. I spoke with Rosa's daughter, Carmen Martinez-Wells, yesterday. She provided me with these. The photographs showed 2 young women, standing together in front of a small house, both wearing similar dresses and bright smiles. One of them was unmistakably my grandmother as a young woman. The other looked remarkably similar, with the same dark hair and delicate features. Rosa and your grandmother Rosa Rodriguez were both named Rosa, both born in Mexico, and both came to Tucson as young brides in the early 1940s. They lived next door to each other for nearly 70 years. Detective Chen pulled out more photographs. These ones more recent. They showed 2 elderly women sitting on a porch together, holding hands and laughing. My grandmother was wearing her engagement ring, and Rosa Martinez was wearing what appeared to be an identical ring. They were so close that people often mistook them for sisters. Carmen Martinez-Wells told me that her mother always said she and your grandmother were like 2 halves of the same soul. But I don't understand. How does this connect to David? Detective Chen's expression darkened. David's father, Robert Thompson, married Rosa Martinez's daughter, Isabella, in 1988. That would make Rosa Martinez David's grandmother by marriage. His grandmother by marriage, I repeated slowly, trying to understand the implications. When Rosa Martinez developed dementia and had to move into the nursing home, her family had to go through her possessions and decide what to keep, what to donate, and what to sell. According to Carmen Martinez-Wells, Rosa had always treasured 2 things above all else: a collection of letters from her husband who died in Vietnam and her mother's engagement ring. Detective Chen placed another document in front of me. This is the intake inventory from Sunset Manor Nursing Home, dated March 2023. It lists Rosa Martinez's personal effects when she was admitted. The engagement ring is not listed among her belongings. Someone took it before she was admitted? According to Carmen, the ring disappeared sometime during the week before Rosa was moved to the nursing home. The family was busy sorting through decades of possessions, and several family members had access to the house. Carmen assumed one of her cousins had taken it for safekeeping, but when she started asking around, nobody knew where it was. My heart was pounding now. And she thinks David took it? She's certain David took it, but here's where it gets complicated. Detective Chen pulled out another set of documents. I've been investigating the GIA records for the diamond in your ring. It turns out that the original certification from 1995 contains an error. What kind of error? The stone was purchased and certified by David Thompson Sr., not David. Thompson Jr., David's father, bought the diamond in 1995 and had it reset in a modern mounting. But the GIA database only shows the last name and first initial, so it appeared to be your David when the records were searched. I felt like I was drowning in information. So David's father had Rosa Martinez's mother's ring reset in 1995? It appears that way, but here's where the story gets even more disturbing. Detective Chen opened yet another folder. I've been able to trace the financial records for David Thompson Sr. In 1995, he was working as a bookkeeper for several elderly clients in Tucson, including Rosa Martinez. He was her bookkeeper? He was managing her finances, paying her bills, helping her with insurance claims. He had complete access to her bank accounts and her personal property. Detective Chen's voice hardened. In December 1995, Rosa Martinez filed an insurance claim for a stolen engagement ring valued at $8,000. The claim was approved, and she received the full amount. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together in the most horrifying way possible. David's father stole Rosa's ring, collected the insurance money for her, and then used that money to have the ring reset so it wouldn't be recognizable. That's exactly what happened, and it gets worse. Detective Chen pulled out a bank statement. David Thompson Sr. deposited the $8,000 insurance check into his own account, not Rosa's. I stared at the bank statement, seeing David Sr.'s name clearly printed as the account holder. He stole her ring and her insurance money? Over the course of the next 10 years, David Thompson Sr. systematically embezzled over $100,000 from Rosa Martinez and 3 other elderly clients. He was never caught because none of his victims realized what was happening until it was too late. What happened to him? He died in a car accident in 2006, before any of the thefts were discovered. When Rosa's family finally reviewed her finances after she developed dementia, they found evidence of the embezzlement, but the statute of limitations had expired and the perpetrator was dead. My mind reeled as I tried to process the full scope of what Detective Chen was telling me. David's father had stolen my grandmother's best friend's engagement ring, collected insurance money for the theft, and used that money to have the ring reset. Then he'd somehow passed the ring to his son, who had given it to me as my grandmother's original ring. Detective Chen, there's something I don't understand. How did David end up with the ring? And how did he know to give it to me as my grandmother's ring? That's where the story gets truly diabolical. Detective Chen pulled out what appeared to be a wedding photo. This is a picture of David and Isabella Thompson's wedding in 1988. Look carefully at what Isabella is wearing. I studied the photograph. Isabella Thompson, David's mother, was wearing a beautiful engagement ring that looked remarkably similar to the one I was wearing now. David's father gave his wife Rosa's stolen ring? It appears that way. Isabella wore Rosa's ring as her own engagement ring for nearly 20 years, never knowing it had been stolen from her husband's client. So, when David and I got engaged, David gave you his mother's engagement ring, not knowing it had originally belonged to your grandmother's best friend. Detective Chen paused. But here's where I think David's story becomes even more sinister. She pulled out a final set of documents. I've been investigating David's recent financial activity. In the past 6 months, he's taken out 3 separate loans against your house, totaling $45,000. He's taken loans against our house. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. But I would have had to sign for those. It's my house, too. Detective Chen's expression was grim. Mrs. Thompson, you did sign for those loans. Or rather, someone forged your signature on the loan documents. She showed me copies of loan applications bearing what appeared to be my signature. The handwriting looked like mine, but I had no memory of signing any loan documents. How is that possible? David has had access to your signature for years. He's seen you sign documents, credit card receipts, tax returns. With a little practice, forging your signature would be relatively easy. Detective Chen pointed to specific aspects of the signatures. Look at the way the E in Emma is formed here, versus how you actually write it. The forgeries are good, but they're not perfect. $45,000, I whispered. What did he use the money for? Based on the bank records I've been able to access, approximately $20,000 went to Stephanie Walsh in the form of cash payments and gifts. Another $15,000 appears to have been spent on travel and entertainment. The remaining $10,000 is unaccounted for. I thought about the trips David had claimed were real estate conferences, the expensive gifts he'd bought for Stephanie, the money he'd spent maintaining an affair while I'd been faithfully contributing to what I thought was our shared future. Mrs. Thompson, there's one more thing you need to know. Detective Chen's voice was gentler now. I contacted Carmen Martinez-Wells and told her about your situation. She would very much like to meet with you. She wants to meet with me? She said that her mother, Rosa, talked about your grandmother constantly, especially in the months before she died. Rosa was heartbroken that she'd lost touch with your family after your grandmother passed away. Carmen thinks Rosa would want her ring to be returned to your grandmother's family. But the ring legally belongs to me now. David gave it to me. That's true, but Carmen isn't asking for the ring back. She's asking for something else. Detective Chen smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. She's asking for justice. What do you mean? Carmen Martinez-Wells wants to press charges against David for fraud and theft. The forged loan documents alone are enough for multiple felony charges. Combined with his attempt to sell stolen property, David could be looking at several years in prison. The weight of everything Detective Chen had told me settled over me like a heavy blanket. David wasn't just an unfaithful husband. He was a criminal who had inherited his father's talent for deception and theft. He had knowingly given me a stolen ring, forged my signature on loan documents, and embezzled tens of thousands of dollars from our joint accounts. What happens now? That depends on what you want to happen. You could simply file for divorce and try to recover the money David stole. Or you could work with Carmen Martinez-Wells to pursue criminal charges. I thought about my grandmother and the stories she'd told me about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. I thought about Rosa Martinez, David's own step-grandmother, who had been victimized by his father and was now being victimized again by his son. I want to press charges, I said firmly. I want David to face consequences for what he's done. Detective Chen nodded approvingly. Then I'll contact the Phoenix Police Department and the FBI. The forged loan documents make this a federal case, and the interstate nature of some of David's activities could add additional charges. How long will this take? The wheels of justice turn slowly, but given the evidence we have, I expect David will be arrested within the next few days. You should prepare yourself for that possibility. As I drove home from Detective Chen's office, my mind struggled to process everything I'd learned. David wasn't the man I'd thought I married. He was the son of a thief who had inherited both his father's criminal tendencies and his father's stolen goods. The ring I'd worn for 4 years, believing it connected me to my grandmother's legacy, actually connected me to a decades-old crime that had victimized my grandmother's best friend. But strangely, I didn't feel devastated anymore. I felt angry, and I felt determined, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months, powerful. David thought he could manipulate me, steal from me, and discard me when someone younger and more convenient came along. He thought I was too naive to notice what he was doing, too trusting to question his lies, too weak to fight back when I discovered the truth. He was wrong about all of it. When I arrived home that evening, David's car was already in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see him moving around inside, probably preparing another charming dinner designed to distract me from the destruction he'd been causing in our lives. But this time, I wasn't walking into that house as a confused and betrayed wife. I was walking in as someone who knew exactly who David Thompson really was and exactly what he'd done. And tomorrow, when Detective Chen called to tell me that warrants had been issued for his arrest, I would be ready to watch his whole world collapse around him just as he'd tried to collapse mine. The confrontation was coming, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid of it. I was looking forward to it. The morning air in Phoenix carried an unusual chill for late spring as I stood on my back patio, coffee mug in hand, watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson. My phone buzzed with Detective Chen's call at exactly 8:37, and I knew immediately that this was the moment everything would change. Mrs. Thompson, the warrants have been signed and sealed. Federal agents will be executing the arrest within the next 90 minutes. Are you emotionally prepared for what's about to unfold? Through the sliding glass door, I could see David, at our kitchen table, scrolling through his phone with that familiar smirk that I now recognized as the expression of someone who believed he was smarter than everyone around him. He was wearing the charcoal gray suit I'd helped him pick out for our anniversary dinner last year, back when I still believed our marriage meant something to him. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I replied, stepping further into the desert garden where the morning breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming Palo Verde trees. "The federal task force is coordinating with Phoenix PD because of the interstate nature of some of the financial crimes. Mrs. Thompson, I want you to understand that when this arrest happens, it's going to be significant. Multiple agencies, multiple charges, and definitely media attention given the scope of what we've uncovered." "What do you mean by scope?" "David's criminal activities extend far beyond what we initially discovered. The FBI has identified at least 12 other victims, including several elderly individuals who lost their life savings to schemes similar to what happened to Rosa Martinez. Your husband didn't just steal from you, Emma. He's been running a sophisticated operation targeting vulnerable people for years." The weight of Detective Chen's words settled over me like a heavy blanket. David wasn't just an unfaithful husband who had made some poor choices. He was a career criminal who had used our marriage as cover for systematic fraud and theft. I thought about all the evenings he'd come home late, claiming he'd been showing houses or meeting with clients. How many of those nights had he actually spent victimizing elderly people, stealing their savings, destroying their financial security? "Detective Chen, will I need to testify against him?" "Almost certainly, yes. But Emma, you should know that the evidence against David is overwhelming. Between the forged documents, the bank records, the testimony from his victims, and the physical evidence we've collected, this case is essentially airtight. Your testimony will be important, but it won't be the make-or-break factor." After ending the call, I returned to the kitchen where David was buttering a piece of whole wheat toast, humming some tune I didn't recognize. The casual normalcy of the scene felt almost grotesque, given what I knew was coming. In less than 2 hours, federal agents would be placing him under arrest for crimes that could send him to prison for decades. "You seem cheerful this morning," I observed, refilling my coffee mug and studying his face for any sign that he suspected what was about to happen. "Why shouldn't I be? Beautiful day, beautiful wife, beautiful life." His smile was the same charming grin that had originally attracted me to him 6 years ago, but now it looked predatory. "Besides, I've got some exciting developments at work that I can't wait to share with you tonight." More lies. I wondered if David was even capable of telling the truth anymore, or if deception had become so ingrained in his personality that he couldn't turn it off even in casual conversation. "What kind of developments? Big commission coming through, maybe the biggest of my career? We might finally be able to afford that vacation to Europe you've been talking about." David reached across the table and squeezed my hand, his touch making my skin crawl. "I know I've been working a lot lately, but it's all going to pay off soon." The Europe vacation was something I'd mentioned once, almost 2 years ago, and David had dismissed it as too expensive and impractical. Now he was using it as another prop in his elaborate performance, another way to keep me believing in a future that existed only in his lies. "That sounds wonderful," I said, forcing myself to smile back at him. "Any particular clients involved?" "Just some elderly folks who need help managing their investments. You know how it is, they've got money, but they don't really understand modern financial markets. They need someone they can trust to help them make smart decisions. Elderly folks who need help managing their investments." The casual way he described his victims made my stomach turn. David was talking about vulnerable people as if they were nothing more than business opportunities, resources to be exploited for his personal gain. "Well, I hope everything works out the way you're planning," I said, and for the first time in months, I was being completely honest with my husband. David finished his breakfast, kissed my forehead in a gesture that felt more like marking territory than showing affection, and headed toward the garage. I'll probably be late again tonight, but I promise we'll celebrate this weekend. Maybe dinner at that steakhouse you like? That would be nice, I replied, knowing that by this weekend, David would be sitting in a federal detention center awaiting arraignment on multiple felony charges. I watched his BMW pull out of our driveway and disappear down Maple Street, noting how he drove just slightly over the speed limit with the confidence of someone who believed rules didn't apply to him. It occurred to me that this was probably the last time I would see David as a free man, and I felt nothing but relief. The waiting was excruciating in a way I hadn't anticipated. I tried to work from my home office, responding to client emails and reviewing marketing proposals, but my concentration was completely shattered. Every car that passed our house made my heart race. Every sound from outside made me wonder if this was the moment. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, as if Detective Chen might call with updates or delays. At 10:45, I heard the unmistakable sound of multiple vehicles pulling up in front of our house. Through my office window, I watched as two black SUVs and a Phoenix police patrol car positioned themselves strategically around our property. 6 people emerged from the vehicles, 4 in dark business suits who moved with the purposeful efficiency of federal agents, and 2 uniformed police officers who took positions at either end of our front yard. My phone rang almost immediately. Detective Chen's voice was crisp and professional. "Mrs. Thompson, the team is at your residence, but David isn't home. Do you have any information about his current whereabouts? He left for work around 8:45. He said he had meetings with elderly clients today." The irony wasn't lost on me that David might be arrested while in the process of victimizing another vulnerable person. "We have units moving to locate his vehicle now. Mrs. Thompson, we also have a search warrant for your home. I know this is difficult, but we need to collect any remaining evidence that might be stored on the premises." "I understand. Do whatever you need to do." Agent Sarah Rodriguez, a woman approximately my age with intelligent dark eyes and an air of calm authority, knocked on my front door 15 minutes later. She was accompanied by a forensic accountant named Michael Chen and 2 other agents whose names I didn't catch in my nervous state. "Mrs. Thompson, I want to thank you for your cooperation throughout this investigation," Agent Rodriguez said, as she showed me the search warrant. "I know this situation is incredibly difficult for you personally, but your willingness to pursue justice has exposed a criminal enterprise that has victimized dozens of innocent people." Criminal enterprise? David Thompson has been operating what we call a trust mill targeting elderly individuals. He gains their confidence, convinces them to give him access to their financial accounts, and then systematically drains their resources while maintaining the appearance of legitimate investment management. Agent Rodriguez explained that David's methods were sophisticated and carefully planned. He would identify potential victims through real estate contacts, church directories, and senior community events. He would spend months building relationships with them, presenting himself as a successful businessman who could help them maximize their retirement savings. Once he gained their trust, he would convince them to consolidate their accounts under his management, giving him access to hundreds of thousands of dollars in retirement funds. "The victims often don't realize they've been robbed until it's too late," Agent Rodriguez continued. "David was skilled at providing fake statements and reports that made it appear their investments were growing when he was actually stealing from them. As the federal agents methodically searched our home, I felt like I was watching my old life being dismantled piece by piece. They photographed David's home office, collected his computer equipment, and carefully documented every financial record they could find. In our bedroom safe, they discovered cash, jewelry, and documents I had never seen before. Mrs. Thompson, were you aware that your husband maintained a safety deposit box at First National Bank?" Agent Rodriguez asked, showing me a key they'd found hidden in David's sock drawer. "No, I had no idea. We'll be getting a warrant for that box, but based on the pattern we've seen with other cases, it likely contains cash and possibly stolen items from his victims." The forensic accountant, Michael Chen, spent over an hour examining our joint bank accounts and credit card statements. He showed me transactions I had never noticed or had accepted David's explanations for. Regular cash withdrawals, payments to companies I didn't recognize, transfers to accounts that weren't in our names. Mrs. Thompson, your husband has been very careful about hiding his criminal income, but there are patterns here that clearly indicate money laundering, Michael explained. Small, regular transfers designed to avoid triggering automatic reporting. Requirements, payments disguised as business expenses, cash deposits that don't correspond to any legitimate income source. How much money are we talking about? Based on what we've found so far, David has stolen approximately $400,000 from his victims over the past 3 years. That's in addition to the money he forged loan documents to steal. From you. $400,000. The number was staggering. I thought about the elderly people who had trusted David with their life savings, who had believed his promises about secure investments and comfortable retirements. I thought about how they must have felt when they discovered their money was gone, stolen by someone they had welcomed into their homes and treated like family. Agent Rodriguez's phone rang while the search was still in progress. She stepped outside to take the call, returning a few minutes later with news I had been anticipating. Mrs. Thompson, your husband has been taken into custody. He was arrested at the apartment complex where Stephanie Walsh lives. He was at Stephanie's apartment? I thought he was meeting with clients. Apparently, Ms. Walsh called him in a panic this morning when FBI agents showed up at her workplace with questions about the money David had been spending on her. David went to her apartment to try to coordinate their stories, which actually made our job easier since we could arrest them both at the same location. The thought of David being handcuffed in front of Stephanie's apartment building gave me a momentary sense of satisfaction. His carefully constructed image of successful businessman was crumbling in the most public and humiliating way possible. What happens to Stephanie? She's being charged as an accessory to the financial crimes. She claims she didn't know the money David was spending on her was stolen, but text messages we recovered from both of their phones suggest she was more aware of David's activities than she initially admitted. The federal agents spent another 2 hours in my house, carefully cataloging evidence and photographing everything that might be relevant to David's criminal activities. When they finally finished, our home looked the same but felt completely different. The space no longer contained any trace of David's presence or personality. It was as if he had been surgically removed from my life. After the agents left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the profound silence that follows a life-changing event. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. The weight of carrying David's secrets, of living with his lies, of wondering what other betrayals might be waiting to be discovered, was finally lifted from my shoulders. My phone buzzed with a text message from Carmen Martinez-Wells. I saw the news about David's arrest on the local news. Are you okay? Would you like some company? I realized that David's arrest had probably been covered by local media, given the scope of the charges and the number of victims involved. The thought of being portrayed as the naive wife who had no idea what her husband was doing made me cringe, but I also felt a strange sense of pride. I hadn't been naive. I had been systematically deceived by someone who was skilled at deception. And when I finally had enough information to act, I had acted decisively. I texted Carmen back, "I'm doing better than okay. I feel free. Would you like to come over for coffee?" Carmen arrived an hour later carrying a bottle of wine and a concerned expression that gradually transformed into amazement as I told her everything that had happened since our last conversation. "Emma, I can't believe how brave you've been through all of this. Most people would have been too intimidated to pursue charges against their own husband." "I don't think it was bravery," I replied, pouring wine into glasses that David would never drink from again. "I think it was anger. Pure, righteous anger at being treated like I was too stupid to notice what was happening to my own life." Carmen and I spent the rest of the afternoon talking about our grandmothers, about the friendship that had connected our families across decades, and about the strange twists of fate that had brought us together. As the desert sun began to set, outside my windows, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. "Carmen, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "When you found out about your mother's ring being stolen, how did you handle the anger? How did you cope with knowing that someone you trusted had betrayed her?" Carmen was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in her glass thoughtfully. "At first, I wanted revenge. I wanted David's father to suffer the way my mother had suffered. But then I realized that carrying that anger was only hurting me. My mother was beyond being hurt by David Thompson Sr.'s actions, but I was letting his crimes poison my present." "How did you let go of it?" "I decided to focus on what I could control instead of what I couldn't change. I couldn't bring my grandfather's ring back or undo the trauma my mother experienced, but I could make sure the truth came to light and that future victims were protected." Carmen's words resonated with me in a way I hadn't expected. David's betrayal had hurt me deeply, but allowing that hurt to define my future would be giving him power over me that he didn't deserve. The next several weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings, media interviews, and meetings with victim advocates. David's arrest had triggered an avalanche of additional complaints from elderly people who recognized his photo in news reports and realized they had been victimized by him. The scope of his criminal activities was far greater than anyone had initially suspected. Detective Chen called me regularly with updates on the investigation. "Emma, we've now identified over 30 victims spanning the past 5 years. The total amount stolen appears to be close to $800,000. $800,000? The number was incomprehensible to me. David was operating on a much larger scale than we originally thought. He wasn't just stealing from individuals. He was also embezzling from a senior investment group that trusted him to manage their collective retirement funds. The senior investment group turned out to be a collection of retired teachers, firefighters, and police officers who had pooled their resources to hire David as their financial advisor. He had convinced them to move their funds into what he claimed were high-yield investment accounts, but the money had actually been transferred into accounts he controlled. For 3 years, he had been providing them with fake statements while spending their retirement savings on his affair with Stephanie and his own personal expenses. How could he do that to people who trusted him? Emma, people like David don't see their victims as human beings with feelings and rights. They see them as resources to be exploited. The psychological profile we've developed suggests that David has what's called narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features. He's incapable of feeling genuine empathy for the people he hurts. The psychological evaluation explained a lot about my marriage to David. His inability to consider my feelings when making major decisions, his tendency to dismiss my concerns as overreactions, his skill at making me doubt my own perceptions. These weren't character flaws or relationship problems. They were symptoms of a personality disorder that made him fundamentally incapable of genuine intimacy or partnership. David's arraignment was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late April. I wasn't required to attend, but I decided I wanted to see him face the consequences of his actions. Carmen offered to accompany me for moral support, and we arrived at the federal courthouse early to avoid the media attention that had been following the case. Seeing David in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs was surreal. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the institutional clothing and the gravity of his situation. When he saw me in the gallery, his expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like hope, as if he thought I might be there to support him. The federal prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, methodically outlined the charges against David: mail fraud, wire fraud, elder abuse, money laundering, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The list seemed to go on forever, and with each new charge, David's shoulders sagged a little more. Your Honor, the defendant has engaged in a sophisticated criminal enterprise that has victimized vulnerable members of our community, AUSA Walsh stated. The financial harm caused by his actions exceeds $1 million when we include interest and penalties, and the emotional trauma inflicted on his victims is immeasurable. $1 million. Somehow, between our last conversation and the arraignment, the scope of David's crimes had grown even larger. David's court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, argued for bail and claimed that David wasn't a flight risk because of his ties to the community. AUSA Walsh responded by presenting evidence that David had been making plans to flee the country, including travel searches on his computer and inquiries about moving money to offshore accounts. Your Honor, the defendant's own internet search history shows queries for countries without extradition treaties with the United States, and how to transfer money to Cayman Islands accounts. These are not the actions of someone who intended to face responsibility for his crimes. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, denied bail and remanded David to federal custody pending trial. As he was led away in shackles, David turned to look at me one more time. I met his gaze without emotion, feeling nothing but relief that he would be unable to hurt anyone else while the legal process played out. Outside the courthouse, Carmen and I were approached by several reporters asking for comments about David's arrest and the impact on his victims. I had prepared a brief statement with the help of a victim advocate. My husband systematically deceived me and dozens of other people who trusted him. The financial damage he caused is significant, but the emotional trauma he inflicted on vulnerable, elderly people is immeasurable. I hope that his prosecution sends a message that financial elder abuse will not be tolerated in our community. One reporter asked if I had known about David's criminal activities during our marriage. The question stung because it implied that I might have been complicit in his crimes. I was as much a victim of David Thompson's deception as anyone else. He stole from, I replied firmly. The difference is that when I discovered what he was doing, I had the resources and support system to fight back. Many of his other victims didn't have those advantages. As Carmen and I walked back to our cars, she squeezed my arm supportively. You handled that perfectly. Those reporters were trying to make you seem like either a villain or a victim, but you showed them you're a survivor. I'm still learning how to be a survivor instead of a victim, I admitted. Some days are easier than others. Over the following months, the legal proceedings against David moved forward with surprising speed. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that his lawyer began negotiating a plea agreement almost immediately. David's decision to cooperate with the investigation was motivated primarily by his desire to avoid a trial that could result in a life sentence. As part of his cooperation, David provided detailed information about his criminal methods and helped investigators locate additional victims who hadn't yet realized they'd been robbed. The information he provided led to the recovery of approximately $200,000 in cash and assets that he had hidden in various accounts and safety deposit boxes. Detective Chen called me with updates on the victim restitution process. Emma, because David is cooperating and because we've been able to recover some of the stolen funds, most of his victims will receive at least partial restitution. It won't make them whole, but it's better than nothing. What about the emotional damage? How do you compensate people for the trauma of being betrayed by someone they trusted? You don't. That's the part of David's crimes that can never be undone. But at least his victims will know that justice was served and that he'll spend significant time in prison thinking about what he did to them. The plea agreement negotiations revealed even more disturbing details about David's criminal activities. He had been using his real estate license to gain access to elderly homeowners, convincing them to refinance their mortgages or take out home equity loans, and then diverting the proceeds to accounts he controlled. Several elderly victims had lost their homes because of David's actions. Emma, I need to prepare you for something, Detective Chen said during one of our conversations. When David is sentenced, Some of his victims will probably want to give impact statements in court. You may hear details about what he did to them that will be difficult to listen to. I think I need to hear those details, I replied. I need to understand the full scope of what David was capable of, so I never make the mistake of minimizing what he did to me. The victim impact statements were scheduled for David's sentencing hearing in October, 6 months after his arrest. By that time, investigators had identified 43 separate victims and total losses approaching $1.5 million. I had been asked to give my own impact statement, and I spent weeks preparing what I wanted to say. The federal courthouse was packed for David's sentencing. Dozens of elderly victims and their family members filled the gallery, many of them seeing David in person for the first time since he had stolen from them. The collective anger and pain in that courtroom was palpable. Judge Rebecca Martinez, a distinguished Latina woman with steel gray hair and piercing eyes, listened to victim impact statement after victim impact statement. Elderly men and women spoke about losing their life savings, about being forced to move in with their adult children because they could no longer afford their homes, about the anxiety and depression that followed the discovery that they had been robbed by someone they trusted. One victim, an 87-year-old retired teacher named Margaret Sullivan, spoke about how David had convinced her to cash out her pension to invest in what he claimed was a guaranteed high-return bond fund. I trusted David Thompson because he reminded me of my own grandson, Mrs. Sullivan said, her voice shaking with emotion. He came to my house for dinner. He called me Grandma Maggie. He sent me flowers on my birthday. And while he was pretending to care about me, he was stealing every penny I had saved for my old age. Another victim, a 74-year-old veteran named Robert Chen, described how David had convinced him to take out a reverse mortgage on his family home to fund what David claimed were government-backed securities. I fought in Vietnam to protect this country and its values, Mr. Chen said. I never imagined that the greatest threat to my family's security would come from someone who lived in my own community, someone who shook my hand and called me a hero while he was robbing me blind. When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium and looked directly at David, who was sitting at the defendant's table with his head down, unable or unwilling to make eye contact with his victims. Your Honor, David Thompson didn't just steal money from me and dozens of other people. He stole our sense of security, our ability to trust our own judgment, and our faith in human decency. He used his charm and charisma to identify vulnerable people, and then he exploited that vulnerability for his own personal gain. I paused, gathering my thoughts and my courage. For 4 years, I lived with someone who was systematically deceiving me about fundamental aspects of our shared life. He forged my signature on legal documents. He spent our savings on another woman, and he tried to sell my grandmother's ring to fund his betrayal of our marriage. But more than that, he made me doubt my own perceptions and instincts. He was so skilled at manipulation that I began to question my own sanity. I looked around the courtroom at the faces of David's other victims, drawing strength from their presence and their shared experience of betrayal. The financial losses David caused are significant, but they pale in comparison to the psychological damage he inflicted. He didn't just steal money. He stole our confidence in our ability to protect ourselves and our families. He stole our peace of mind. And in many cases, he stole years from the end of our lives that should have been spent in comfort and security. As I returned to my seat, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. Speaking publicly about David's crimes and their impact on me had been terrifying, but it had also been liberating. I was no longer David Thompson's victim. I was Emma Rodriguez, a survivor who had found her voice and used it to seek justice. Judge Martinez delivered David's sentence with a gravity befitting the scope of his crimes. 22 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Full restitution to all identified victims, totaling $4 million. Lifetime ban from working in financial services or real estate. Forfeiture of all assets acquired through criminal activity. Mr. Thompson, your crimes represent a profound betrayal of trust that has devastated the lives of dozens of innocent people, Judge Martinez said. You targeted the most vulnerable members of our community and exploited their trust for your own personal gain. The sentence I'm imposing reflects the seriousness of your crimes and the need to deter others who might consider similar conduct. 22 years. David would be in his mid-50s when he was released, assuming he served his full sentence. The life he had built through deception and theft was over, and the life he had tried to build with Stephanie and my stolen money would never exist. As David was led away to begin his sentence, I felt no joy or satisfaction, but I did feel justice. The man who had systematically betrayed everyone who trusted him would spend the next 2 decades thinking about the harm he had caused. The elderly victims who had been robbed of their security would know that their suffering had been acknowledged and their dignity restored. The months following David's sentencing were a period of rebuilding and rediscovery for me. I filed for divorce immediately after his conviction, and since David was unable to contest the proceedings from federal prison, the legal process was surprisingly straightforward. Our house, our savings accounts, and all marital assets were awarded to me, both as compensation for the money David had stolen and as acknowledgement that I had been defrauded just like his other victims. I also received a significant settlement from the insurance company that had initially paid out on Rosa Martinez's stolen ring claim 25 years earlier. When the insurance investigators learned that the ring had been recovered and that David's father had committed insurance fraud by filing the false claim, they reopened the case and pursued recovery of the original payout plus interest and penalties. With the insurance settlement and the divorce settlement, I suddenly found myself in a better financial position than I had ever been during my marriage to David. But more importantly, I was free to make decisions about my life without having to consider the opinions or needs of someone who had never truly had my best interests at heart. One of my first decisions was to use some of the settlement money to establish the Rosa Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preventing financial elder abuse and supporting victims of trust-based financial crimes. Carmen Martinez-Wells agreed to serve as the foundation's co-director, and we recruited a board of directors that included Detective Chen, several victim advocates, and representatives from the elderly community. The Rosa Foundation's first major initiative was developing educational materials to help elderly people recognize and avoid financial scams. We created workshops that we presented at senior centers, community centers, and religious organizations throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area. The most important thing to remember is that legitimate financial advisors will never pressure you to make immediate decisions or to keep your financial arrangements secret from your family. I would tell audiences of seniors who reminded me of David's victims. If someone is asking you to act quickly or to hide information from people you trust, that's a red flag that you're being targeted for fraud. The workshops were incredibly well received, partly because Carmen and I could speak from personal experience about the devastating impact of financial elder abuse. We weren't academic experts or government officials lecturing about theoretical problems. We were women whose families had been directly affected by these crimes, and we could speak authentically about both the warning signs and the recovery process. The Rosa Foundation also provided direct assistance to victims of financial crimes, helping them navigate the complex legal and financial systems involved in reporting fraud and seeking restitution. Many elderly victims of financial crimes feel ashamed and embarrassed about being deceived, and they often don't know where to turn for help. There's no shame in being victimized by someone who was skilled at deception, I would tell clients who came to us for assistance. The shame belongs to the criminals who exploit trust and vulnerability, not to the people who were victimized. Our second major initiative was working with law enforcement agencies to improve their response to financial elder abuse cases. 2. Often, police officers and prosecutors dismiss financial crimes against the elderly as civil matters rather than criminal cases, or they assume that the victims somehow deserve what happened to them. Detective Chen helped us develop training materials for law enforcement that emphasized the serious criminal nature of financial elder abuse and provided practical guidance for investigating these complex cases. We also worked with prosecutors' offices to ensure that financial crimes against vulnerable adults were treated with the seriousness they deserved. 2 years after David's sentencing, the Rosa Foundation had helped over 100 victims of financial elder abuse recover more than $3 million in stolen assets. We had trained hundreds of law enforcement officers and prosecutors, and our educational workshops had reached thousands of elderly people throughout Arizona. But perhaps most importantly, we had created a community of survivors who supported each other through the difficult process of recovery and healing. Many of David's victims stayed in touch with each other and with the Rosa Foundation, finding comfort in knowing they weren't alone in their experience of betrayal and recovery. Carmen and I also maintained our personal friendship, bonding over our shared experience of seeing justice served for crimes that had affected our families across multiple generations. We visited her mother together regularly until Rosa Martinez passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 years after David's arrest. At Rosa's funeral, Carmen kept her promise and gave me her grandmother's engagement ring, so that both rings could remain together as their original owners had intended. I now wear both rings daily, one on each hand, as a reminder of the enduring power of friendship and the importance of fighting for justice even when the fight is difficult. Emma, my mother would be so proud of what you've accomplished with the Rosa Foundation, Carmen said at the funeral reception. She always believed that good could come from even the worst situations if people were willing to work for it. Rosa Martinez's belief in the possibility of good emerging from tragedy became the unofficial motto of our foundation. Every victim we helped, every criminal we assisted in prosecuting, every elderly person we educated about financial scams was a small victory against the forces of exploitation and betrayal. 5 years after David's arrest, I decided to formalize my commitment to victim advocacy by returning to school for a master's degree in social work with a specialization in victim services. The program was challenging, requiring me to balance coursework with running the Rosa Foundation and maintaining my consulting work, but it gave me the academic credentials and theoretical framework to become even more effective in my advocacy work. My thesis project was a comprehensive study of financial elder abuse prosecution in Arizona, examining factors that led to successful convictions and identifying barriers that prevented victims from seeking justice. The research involved interviewing dozens of victims, law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and defense attorneys to understand the complex dynamics of these cases. One of the most significant findings from my research was that victims who had strong support systems were much more likely to report financial crimes and cooperate with prosecutions than victims who felt isolated and ashamed. This led the Rosa Foundation to develop a peer support program that paired recent victims with survivors who had successfully navigated the legal system. Recovery from financial abuse isn't just about getting your money back, explained Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who consulted with the Rosa Foundation. It's about rebuilding your sense of agency and self-worth after being systematically manipulated and deceived. The peer support program became one of our most successful initiatives, with dozens of survivors volunteering to mentor newly identified victims through the reporting and prosecution process. The volunteers provided emotional support, practical guidance, and living proof that it was possible to rebuild after being victimized by financial predators. My master's degree thesis was eventually published in the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect, and I was invited to present my research findings at national conferences on victim advocacy and financial crimes. The academic recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it helped establish the Rosa Foundation as a national model for community-based responses to financial elder abuse. 7 years after David's arrest, I received a letter from him in federal prison. It was shorter than his previous attempts at communication, but it contained something I hadn't seen in his earlier letters, what appeared to be genuine remorse. Emma, I know you probably won't believe this, and I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. But I need you to know that I understand now what I did to you and to all the other people I hurt. I've spent the past 7 years in therapy trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could steal from elderly people and betray my own wife. The letter went on to describe David's participation in a prison program for white-collar criminals that focused on understanding the impact of their crimes on victims. He had been required to write detailed apology letters to each of his victims and to participate in victim impact sessions where he heard directly from people whose lives had been destroyed by financial crimes. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it, the letter continued. I'm writing to tell you that the work you're doing with the Rosa Foundation is important and meaningful, and that knowing you've turned your experience into something that helps other people gives me hope that some good can come from the terrible things I did. I read David's letter twice, then put it away in a file with his previous correspondence. I didn't respond to it, but I also didn't throw it away. It represented a piece of closure that I hadn't known I needed. Acknowledgement from David himself that his crimes had been serious and harmful, and recognition that my choice to pursue justice and advocacy had been the right one. 8 years. After David's arrest, I was offered a position as the Director of Victim Services for the Arizona Attorney General's office. The job would involve overseeing victim advocacy programs throughout the state and working with law enforcement agencies to improve their response to crimes against vulnerable populations. Accepting the position meant stepping back from day-to-day operations at the Rosa Foundation, but Carmen and I had been preparing for this transition for months. The foundation had grown large enough to require a full-time executive director, and we had identified and hired an experienced nonprofit administrator to take over the operational responsibilities. Emma, this job is the perfect next step for you, Carmen said when I told her about the opportunity. You'll be able to influence policy at the state level and help create systemic changes that could prevent thousands of people from being victimized. She was right. The Rosa Foundation had demonstrated that community-based victim advocacy could be incredibly effective, but lasting change required policy reforms and systemic improvements that could only be implemented at the state level. My new position with the Attorney General's office allowed me to work on legislation that would strengthen penalties for financial crimes against vulnerable adults, improve training requirements for financial advisors working with elderly clients, and create mandatory reporting systems for suspected elder abuse. The work was challenging, but deeply satisfying, knowing that each policy change could potentially protect thousands of people from experiencing what David's victims had endured. One of my first major projects was developing a statewide database of financial elder abuse cases that would allow law enforcement agencies to identify patterns and track repeat offenders across county lines. The database revealed that financial predators like David often moved from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, exploiting gaps in communication between law enforcement agencies. What we're seeing is that financial elder abuse is much more organized and systematic than most people realize, I explained to a legislative committee reviewing our proposed reforms. These aren't isolated cases of opportunistic theft. They're sophisticated criminal enterprises that specifically target vulnerable populations. The legislative hearings provided an opportunity to educate lawmakers about the scope and impact of financial elder abuse in Arizona. I invited several of David's victims to testify about their experiences, and their powerful testimony helped convince skeptical legislators that stronger laws were necessary. Margaret Sullivan, the retired teacher who had lost her pension to David's investment scheme, spoke with particular eloquence about the long-term impact of financial victimization. Honorable members of the legislature, when someone steals your car, you call the police and your insurance company, and eventually you get a new car, she said. When someone steals your life savings, you don't get a new life. You don't get back the years you could have spent in financial security. You don't get back the peace of mind that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself. The legislative package we developed was comprehensive and groundbreaking. It included mandatory training for financial advisors on recognizing and reporting elder abuse, increased penalties for financial crimes against vulnerable adults, enhanced restitution requirements that included compensation for emotional distress, and funding for victim advocacy programs modeled on the Rosa Foundation. The legislation passed with overwhelming bipartisan support and was signed into law by the governor in a ceremony attended by dozens of elder abuse survivors and their advocates. Standing behind the governor as she signed the bill into law, felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went far beyond personal satisfaction. This legislation represents a fundamental shift in how our state responds to crimes against our most vulnerable citizens, the governor said during the signing ceremony. We're sending a clear message that Arizona will not tolerate financial predators who target elderly residents. The new laws had immediate practical effects. Within 6 months of implementation, prosecutions of financial elder abuse cases increased by 40% statewide. The mandatory reporting requirements helped identify victims who might otherwise have suffered in silence, and the enhanced penalties served as a deterrent to would-be criminals. The success of Arizona's reforms attracted national attention, and I was invited to consult with other states that wanted to implement similar legislation. I traveled throughout the country, sharing our model and helping other victim advocates build their own programs. During one of these consulting trips to Colorado, I met Dr. James Morrison, a criminologist who specialized in white-collar crime prevention. We discovered a shared passion for protecting vulnerable populations from financial exploitation, and our professional collaboration gradually developed into a personal relationship. James was everything David had never been: honest, transparent, supportive of my work, and genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings. He had dedicated his career to studying and preventing the kinds of crimes that David had committed, which gave him a deep understanding of what I had experienced and why my advocacy work was so important to me. Emma, what you've built with the Rosa Foundation, and now with the state program, is remarkable, James said during one of our early conversations. You've taken personal trauma and transformed it into systemic change that's protecting thousands of people. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than passion and chemistry. After my experience with David, I was wary of trusting my judgment about men, but James's consistency and integrity gradually convinced me that not all relationships were based on deception and manipulation. We were married in a small ceremony 3 years after we met, surrounded by friends and colleagues from the victim advocacy community. Carmen served as my matron of honor, and many of David's former victims attended the celebration. The wedding felt like a celebration not just of my relationship with James, but of my journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Emma, your grandmother, would be so proud of the woman you've become, Carmen said during her toast at the reception. She raised you to be strong and independent, and you've used that strength to protect other people from the kind of harm that was done to our families. James and I settled into a comfortable life in Phoenix, where we both continued our work in victim advocacy and crime prevention. Our home became a gathering place for advocates, researchers, and survivors who shared our commitment to protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. 10 years after David's arrest, I received notification that he was eligible for parole consideration. As one of his victims, I had the right to provide input on his parole application, and I spent considerable time thinking about what I wanted to say. The David Thompson who was eligible for parole was a different person than the man who had been arrested a decade earlier. According to his prison records, he had completed multiple rehabilitation programs, earned a college degree in social work, and participated in victim impact programs that had given him a deeper understanding of the harm he had caused. His parole application included letters from fellow inmates, prison counselors, and program directors who described his transformation and commitment to making amends for his crimes. He had also written a detailed plan for his post-release life that included working with nonprofit organizations focused on financial literacy and fraud prevention. Mrs. Rodriguez, "Do you have any concerns about Mr. Thompson's release?" asked the parole officer who contacted me about the hearing. I thought carefully before responding. I believe that people can change, and it sounds like David has done significant work to understand and address the issues that led to his criminal behavior. However, I think it's important that his parole conditions include ongoing supervision and restrictions on his access to vulnerable populations. The parole board ultimately granted David's release under strict conditions that included 5 years of supervised probation, community service with victim advocacy organizations, and lifetime restrictions on working in financial services or real estate. He was also required to continue therapy and to participate in ongoing victim impact programs. I never saw David after his release, but I occasionally heard updates about his activities through the Victim Advocacy Network. He moved to a different state and found work with a nonprofit organization that provided financial literacy education to low-income families. His supervisors reported that he was a dedicated employee who brought unique insights to the organization's fraud prevention efforts. "It's ironic," James observed, when I shared the updates about David's post-prison life. "He's now doing exactly the kind of work that could have prevented him from becoming a criminal in the first place." The irony wasn't lost on me, but I found it encouraging rather than frustrating. David's transformation, if genuine, represented proof that even people who commit serious crimes can change and contribute positively to society. His knowledge of how financial predators operate could be valuable in protecting future victims. 15 years after David's arrest, the Rosa Foundation had become a nationally recognized model for community-based victim advocacy. We had helped over 1,000 victims recover millions of dollars in stolen assets, trained thousands of law enforcement officers and prosecutors, and educated countless elderly people about financial fraud prevention. The foundation had also spawned similar organizations in 12 other states, creating a network of victim advocates who shared resources, strategies, and support. Carmen and I remained actively involved with the foundation's work, even as our professional lives took us in different directions. "Emma, when we started this foundation, I never imagined it would grow into something this significant," Carmen said during our annual board meeting. "We thought we were just trying to help a few people in our community, but we've ended up changing how the entire country responds to financial elder abuse." The transformation was remarkable to consider. What had started as a personal quest for justice after discovering David's crimes had evolved into a movement that was protecting vulnerable people throughout the United States. Every victim we helped, every criminal we assisted in prosecuting, every policy we influenced was a step toward a world where financial predators like David would find it harder to exploit the trust and vulnerability of innocent people. My work with the Attorney General's office had also expanded over the years. I now oversaw victim services programs for all types of crimes, not just financial offenses, and I had been appointed to serve on several national committees focused on victim rights and crime prevention. The position gave me opportunities to influence policy at the federal level, working with Congress and federal agencies to strengthen protections for vulnerable populations. I testified before congressional committees, consulted on federal legislation, and participated in international conferences on victim advocacy. "Mrs. Rodriguez, your expertise in financial elder abuse has made you one of the most respected victim advocates in the country," said Senator Patricia Williams during a congressional hearing on strengthening elder abuse laws. "Your personal experience combined with your professional accomplishments gives you a unique perspective on these issues." The recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it provided platforms to advocate for policies that could prevent other people from experiencing what David's victims had endured. Every speech I gave, every article I wrote, every law I helped draft was an opportunity to protect someone else's grandmother from being victimized by someone else's David. 20 years after David's arrest, I was invited to speak at a conference celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Older Americans Act. The conference brought together researchers, advocates, policymakers, and survivors from throughout the country to discuss progress in protecting elderly Americans from abuse and exploitation. My keynote address focused on the evolution of victim advocacy over the past 2 decades and the lessons learned from high-profile cases like David's prosecution. I spoke about the importance of believing victims, supporting survivors, and creating systems that prioritize protection over profit. 20 years ago, financial elder abuse was often dismissed as a family problem or a civil matter that didn't warrant serious law enforcement attention, I told the audience. Today, we recognize it as a serious crime that requires coordinated responses from law enforcement, victim advocates, financial institutions, and community organizations. After my speech, I was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Sarah Chen, a graduate student in criminology who was writing her thesis on financial elder abuse prevention. Mrs. Rodriguez, I've read all of your research and followed the Rosa Foundation's work throughout my undergraduate studies, she said. Your story was actually what inspired me to pursue a career in victim advocacy. Conversations like that one reminded me why the work was so important. Each person who was inspired to join the fight against financial exploitation multiplied the impact of every advocacy effort. The movement that had started with my grandmother's stolen ring was now inspiring a new generation of advocates who would carry the work forward. As I approached my 60th birthday, I began thinking about legacy and succession planning for the programs I had built over the past 2 decades. The Rosa Foundation was thriving under its current leadership. The state victim services programs were well established and well funded, and the policy reforms we had championed were making a measurable difference in protecting vulnerable populations. James and I also began discussing our own future, including plans for semi-retirement that would allow us to travel, spend time with family, and perhaps write a book about our experiences in victim advocacy and crime prevention. Emma, you've spent the past 20 years turning your personal trauma into social change, James said during one of our conversations about the future. You've more than fulfilled any obligation to help other people. It's time to think about what you want to do for yourself. But the truth was that the advocacy work had become so central to my identity that I couldn't imagine fully stepping away from it. The Rosa Foundation, the policy work, the speaking engagements, the mentoring of young advocates, all of it felt like natural extensions of who I had become rather than obligations I had to fulfill. I think what I want to do for myself is exactly what I'm already doing, I told James. The difference is that now I get to choose how much of it I take on and what aspects I focus on. We compromised on a plan that would allow me to step back from administrative responsibilities while continuing to work on the projects and issues that were most meaningful to me. I would remain involved with the Rosa Foundation as an emeritus board member, continue writing and speaking about victim advocacy issues, and perhaps teach occasional courses at the university level. The transition felt natural and appropriate. After 2 decades of building programs and institutions, I was ready to focus on sharing knowledge and mentoring the next generation of advocates who would continue the work. On the 25th anniversary of David's arrest, Carmen and I organized a reunion of his victims and their families. Many of the people who had been devastated by David's crimes had rebuilt their lives and found ways to thrive despite the trauma they had experienced. Margaret Sullivan, now 92 years old, had become a volunteer with the Rosa Foundation and had helped dozens of other financial abuse victims navigate the recovery process. Robert Chen had started a support group for elderly veterans who had been targeted by financial scams. Several other victims had become advocates in their own communities, using their experiences to educate others about fraud prevention. Looking around this room, I'm amazed by the resilience and strength of everyone here, I said during my remarks at the reunion. 25 years ago, David Thompson tried to destroy our financial security and our faith in human decency. Instead, he inadvertently created a community of advocates who have protected thousands of other people from similar harm. The reunion was emotional, but also celebratory. We mourned the losses we had experienced and acknowledged the trauma that David's crimes had caused. But we also celebrated the ways we had transformed that trauma into positive change. As the evening wound down, Carmen and I stood together looking at the 2 engagement rings I still wore daily. The rings that had started this entire journey by revealing David's criminal activities had become symbols of friendship, resilience, and the power of seeking justice even when the odds seem overwhelming. Emma, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gotten that phone call from Harrison's Fine Jewelry? Carmen asked. I thought about the question seriously. If the jewelry store hadn't called, David would have successfully sold my grandmother's ring. He would have bought Stephanie a car with the proceeds, and I might never have discovered his affair or his criminal activities. He would have continued victimizing elderly people while I remained unaware of what he was really doing. I think David would have eventually been caught anyway, I said finally. Criminals like him usually get greedy and make mistakes that expose them, but if that phone call hadn't come when it did, a lot more people would have been hurt before he was stopped. And you might never have found your calling as an advocate. That was true. My work with the Rosa Foundation and the State Victim Services programs had become the most meaningful aspects of my life. The opportunity to help other people heal from trauma while working to prevent similar crimes from occurring had given me a sense of purpose that I might never have discovered otherwise. Sometimes I think my grandmother's ring was meant to be stolen, I mused. Not because she deserved it, but because recovering it led to exposing David's crimes and ultimately protecting so many other people. Carmen smiled and squeezed my hand. I think both of our grandmothers would approve of what we've built from their stolen ring. They were women who believed in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that devastating phone call 25 years earlier to the fulfilling life I now lived. David had tried to steal more than my grandmother's ring. He had tried to steal my agency, my independence, and my ability to trust my own judgment. Instead, his crimes had revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed, and had led me to work that made a meaningful difference in the world. The ring he had tried to sell to buy his girlfriend a car had become the foundation of a movement that had protected thousands of vulnerable people from financial exploitation. The house I returned to that evening bore no resemblance to the home I had shared with David. Every room reflected my personality and values, filled with artwork from local artists, books about social justice and victim advocacy, and photographs of the people whose lives had been touched by the Rosa Foundation's work. James was waiting for me with a cup of tea and genuine interest in hearing about the reunion. Our relationship was built on the kind of honesty and mutual respect that I had never experienced with David, proving that it was possible to have a partnership based on equality rather than manipulation. How was it seeing everyone again? He asked as we settled into our favorite chairs in the living room. Inspiring, I said honestly. 25 years ago, we were all just victims trying to figure out how to rebuild our lives. Tonight, we were a room full of advocates who have turned our experiences into something meaningful. As I prepared for bed that evening, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw someone I hardly recognized from the woman who had answered that phone call from Harrison's Fine Jewelry so many years ago. The face looking back at me showed the lines and gray hair that came with age, but also the confidence and strength that came from surviving betrayal and building something meaningful from the ruins. I slipped off the 2 engagement rings and placed them carefully in their shared jewelry box, where they rested side by side as their original owners had intended. Tomorrow, I would put them on again and continue the work of protecting vulnerable people from the kind of exploitation our families had experienced. But tonight, I simply felt grateful. Grateful for the phone call that had revealed the truth about David. Grateful for the strength I had found to pursue justice. Grateful for the community of advocates who had supported me through the difficult years of rebuilding. And grateful for the opportunity to transform personal trauma into social change that would continue protecting people long after I was gone. The ring that David had tried to sell to buy his girlfriend a car had cost him his freedom his marriage, and his future. But it had given me something far more valuable: the knowledge that even the worst betrayals can become the foundation for something meaningful and good, if we have the courage to fight for justice and the wisdom to transform our pain into purpose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.